Good morning, everyone from Panama City. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's webinar, What to Expect at the HLPF, our yearly event that IISD, in collaboration with CEPEI, organizes every year to see what do we expect for the HLPF. For this year, let me first of all introduce myself. I'm Philip Schonrock, the director of CEPEI, one of the co-hosts, and I will run you with a quick overview of what to expect in this webinar and who will be joining us this morning. We will be concentrating on three interrelated themes that we will be discussing today and which will guide us through our conversation. The first one, which it's a logical one for us actually to put on the floor and for the HLPF as well, it is restoring trust in multilateralism, including the role of the regional level. We will also be discussing the regaining momentum and reviving the narrative on the SDGs. And then last but certainly not least, it will be about financing for development, to hear the outcomes of the FFD4 in Seville and how they relate to the HLPF. I will be inviting now everyone, first of all, for a poll that my colleague Matt from IISD will be leading, and simply that everybody knows, my colleague Lotta is sending some housekeeping rules through the chat so that everybody knows and it's on the same page. I appreciate that colleagues are already putting their names, organizations in the chat so that we know who will be with us. Please do so, and happy to have you all with us. Matt, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. You should see a poll popping up on your screen within Zoom asking which region are you joining from. We know that people use many different terms to describe where they're joining from the world, but this is using the UN region, the 5 regions there. So thank you. We have a number of people, all regions being represented. We'll give you a moment for that. And then the second question, once you've completed that, is just a short answer in words, what you're watching for at the HLPF. If there's a particular theme, if your country is presenting its voluntary national review of successes as well as challenges with the SDGs. If there's a particular topic or person you're going to be following, or one of the issues that introduced at the beginning of the webinar. Please feel free to do that, and we'll report back on our findings after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be shared with participants and everyone who registered. So that while people are just finishing this off, I'll throw it back to you.
Thank you very much, Matt, and we will see what comes out actually of this polling. And actually, I wanted to ask, first of all, before we go into now the conversation, we set the stage about what will be happening at the HLPF, what actually our colleagues in the panel are thinking about this year's HLPF. Let me first of all introduce them. It is Lotta Tähtinen, the director of the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination, UN-DESA, who actually has to run the HLPF. So I believe you will have quite a lot of expectations for this year, Lotta. We have Annalisa Prizzon from ODI joining us, as well as Emmanuel, Ikenna, Ohiri, a UN representative, and Lynn Wagner, our colleague from IISD. Let me start with you, Lynn. What are your expectations for this year before we hit it off with the panel discussions? Over to you, and good morning.
Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. I guess just one of the things that I will be watching for, there's so many things from HLPF, it's hard to choose, but the ministerial high-level conversation is going to focus on the UN80, talking about reforming the UN, what is happening now that the UN is 80 and in the middle of this liquidity crisis, and challenges to multilateralism. So, it's a chance for countries to come together and talk about the form of multilateralism that they want to see going forward. And I'll be especially listening for implications for the beyond 2030 period and what it means going forward.
Thank you, Lynn. I will give the floor to Emmanuel to give us his first take about expectations of this year.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are connecting in the world. My expectations for HLPF, I'm really going to be looking for platforming of local and regional governments in collaboration with national coordination for the Sustainable Development Goals, and then also a general sense of how the UN is trying to revitalize itself and lead forward beyond 2030.
Wonderful. Annalisa, over to you.
And also from my side, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. In my case, more than thinking about the key themes of the HLPF, I really would like to see the energy that I've seen in Sevilla last week for the Financing for Development conference, where actually, despite a grim kind of outlook for development cooperation, I actually left quite energized. A lot of discussions actually from ambition to action and from recommendations to results. So I really hope that this kind of energy and not the heat, I would say, will flow from Sevilla up to New York.
Thank you as well, Annalisa. And now, Lotta, we have almost 400 people already connecting from truly around the world, which means there is a big interest about not only you, mine, and their expectations. We actually would like to know, first of all, as an icebreaker, to tell us what your main expectation is. And then I would like to give you the floor to give us a general overview. What can we expect coming to New York? Where are you laying as the UN your focus on, and what are the objectives to move the needle for multilateralism, the acceleration of the SDGs, and of course connecting agendas like the F54 outcomes to the HLPF. So once again, good morning to you from Panama City and over to you in New York. We have the pleasure to have you here, Lotta. So please give us your take and also overview about this year's HLPF.
Well, thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So first, what are my own personal expectations for the HLPF this year? I think really they are two. The first is, as some of the other speakers already mentioned, hoping that the HLPF will truly live up to its character in bringing together both governments, but also a really diverse group of stakeholders, SDG practitioners from around the world, to have truly a dialogue on what do we need to do to move the needle on the SDGs in the 5 years that we have left in implementing the 2030 agenda. And of course, this year we have a particularly, how would I say, vibrant communities, including SDG 5 on gender, which is under review. So I'm truly hoping that we will have, the communities that attach great importance to particular SDGs come together and also look at what do we need to do to implement the SDGs by building on the synergies that exist between the goals. So that's first. My second expectation is this year the HLPF will feature 37 voluntary national reviews from member states. It's fantastic that the VNRs turning 10 years this year, that they continue to attract interest from member states. They continue to come to the HLPF. They want to share with the world what are they doing to implement the 2030 agenda at the national level. So many of these countries have already presented at least one VNR. Many have presented 2, 3, even 4 VNRs. So my personal expectation, hope, is that the VNRs that will be shared at this year's HLPF will be, how would I say, in a more mature stage, rather than just doing a mechanical listing of, where does a country stand with each one of the SDGs, to have a more analytical approach to looking at what are some of the gaps, what are some of the challenges, why are they facing constraints in implementing the SDGs, certain SDGs, and what do they need in order to move ahead. So those are my two personal expectations for the HLPF. So let's see how it unfolds. So colleagues, we are just a few days away. The HLPF will start next week on Monday morning, 14 July, here in New York. The overarching theme for this year's HLPF is advancing sustainable, inclusive, science and evidence-based solutions for the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, for leaving no one behind. So big emphasis on science, evidence-based solutions. The goals that will be reviewed in depth, I already alluded to some of them. The goals will be reviewed include SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 5 on gender equality, SDG 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 14 on life below water, and then of course annually SDG 17, partnerships for the goals. So because of the goals that are under in-depth review this year, the HLPF will be a particularly important stepping stone also towards the social summit, the second World Social Summit that will be held in Qatar in November this year. I hope you have seen, all of you, the program with speakers that's already available on the HLPF website. You can see it's a really exciting group of both government stakeholders, think tank representatives. We have the Deputy Secretary General will open the HLPF on the 14th, and the Secretary General will address the opening of the ministerial days on the 21st of July. One last thing, Philip, I know I'm running out of time. As in previous years, the HLPF will be informed by the annual SDG progress report, which is prepared by the DESA statistical division. And I invite you all to study that progress report carefully, because it really gives a global overview of where do we stand with implementing the SDGs. I think sort of a quick takeaway from the findings of that report is that progress is mixed. We have seen encouraging progress in a number of areas, including a reduction of the number of poor people, improvements in maternal health, child mortality. But of course, and there's been moderate progress towards about 35% of the SDG targets for which data exists. But of course, we are nowhere near where we need to be if this agenda is to be achieved by 2030. Philip, let me wrap it up at that, and I'm happy to come back with some additional thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotta, for this. I actually wanted to put you on the floor again with a quick question, Lotta. You just mentioned the overview, also the SDGs under review and the objectives of this year. What are the main challenges that you see, and that many of the colleagues that are here online are looking also to contribute positively? What should we be looking out for? Is there also an approach from the regions? We heard that restoring trust in multilateralism includes the role of the regional level. What can you tell us about that, and how are actors from the region coming to the HLPF and trying to make a strong point on accelerating the SDGs and connecting it to a wider development agenda?
Thank you, Philip. the regional level is absolutely a cornerstone of the HLPF, and simply also by the fact that in preparation for the HLPF, the regional forum, the regional commissions of the UN all organize their dedicated regional forums on sustainable development, which feed into and inform the annual HLPF. So it really is a cornerstone, the foundation of much of HLPF's work. The program, if you look at the detailed program, we have a dedicated session on the regional dimension of SDG implementation during the second week of the HLPF, where we expect the executive secretaries of the regional commissions to come and share their views from their regions. And also importantly, I want to make this point that in addition to the regional perspective, of course, the whole localization angle of the SDGs is another important dimension. And very happy to say that, as in previous years, there will also be a dedicated session that looks at how are the SDGs being localized, picked up at the local level? What are some of the obstacles and how can we solve those? So exciting session ahead, and I invite you all, if you're not in person in New York, you can follow all the sessions through webcast. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we will be sharing, Lotta, just for your information and for colleagues' information, all the links about where to connect. And also, colleagues, since everybody is asking where is the report that Lotta just referred to, it will be presented by the Secretary General at the HLPF, and then, of course, it will be made public. Lotta, I will leave you now for a moment. I will come back to you with some questions, both for myself and for the participants. But I want to go now to hear about Annalisa's experience in Seville. We already heard it was very hot, but it was also very active and vibrant in the sense of what was achieved, moderated expectations, but a lot of momentum coming out of now the F54 in Seville. I don't want to go ahead about myself, but I'm optimistic to say that this worked out better than expected. I hope I'm right about this, Annalisa, but you're the one that will make the case and let us know what happened in Seville and how these outcomes actually feed into the HLPF and further agenda that we have. So, Annalisa, right back from Seville, tell us what happened, what came out of the F54, and what can we expect for the future.
Thank you so much, Philip. And I would love to kind of elaborate on 3 points if time allows. I mean, first of all, I would love to kind of try and discuss what the Compromiso de Sevilla and more broadly what happened in town actually mean for financing for development and for multilateralism, and therefore also for next week's discussion in New York. Second, the key achievements that we had in Sevilla, but also the areas where would have loved to see more ambition or probably greater granularity. And then third, some reflections on what comes next. So my first point, what the Compromiso de Sevilla and the discussion in Sevilla mean for financing for development and multilateralism. Despite the fact that the US pulled out of the final outcome document, and also a number of member states, notably the European Union, didn't agree with all the recommendations, they say that what the co-facilitators, the co-chairs, and the Secretariat at UN Days achieved was no mean feat. I think, given the circumstances, achieving a kind of a consensus document was a significant milestone. And to a certain extent, also the level of ambition is higher than what we had with the Pact of the Future in September. And we also have a number of different administrations these days. And again, I want to stress, probably wasn't the ambitious document we might have wanted when we started the discussions in Addis Ababa in late June last year with the first PrEP Conf, but I can certainly say this was a kind of a great success for multilateralism. And we also shouldn't kind of forget that there were in Sevilla, I checked the numbers with DESA recently, there were more than 15,000 participants at the conference. And I'm sure many of you have followed very closely or were also in Sevilla. But what was really interesting is that the composition, UN delegations, member states, a number of multilateral development banks that actually participated for the very first time at a UN conference. I think nearly all of them were there. Academia, think tanks, the climate community. And even though, again, I would have kind of expected a greater kind of collaboration between the different parts, I would say that the silos are starting kind of breaking up, a point that Lotta mentioned earlier on as an expectation for HLPF. This kind of dialogue between different kind of communities within working on development actually has happened in Sevilla. And again, I mentioned that in my earlier kind of icebreaker. We started the week with really grim news coming from the OECD. On top of the kind of cuts of 9% to ODA in 2024, we're expecting, based on kind of budgets, not projections, and in another kind of fall up to 17% of ODA, reaching a peak of 28% in sub-Saharan African countries. But I have to say, despite this kind of grim kind of outlook, in Sevilla, I noticed a lot of energy, a lot of commitment to try and find solutions within the kind of current situation. And a couple of examples, and again, very much kind of related to what Lotta was mentioning earlier on, looking into trade, innovation, but also ways to bringing in new actors. I'm referring to institutional investors that could expand their kind of operations in emerging and developing economies. And I would love to kind of discuss briefly, Philip and colleagues, if I'm allowed, some of the key achievements of the Compromiso de Sevilla. But most importantly, I think we need to consider the overall picture. It's not just the document itself, but in Sevilla, there were, I'm switching Sevilla is in English and Sevilla in Spanish. So apologies for shifting from one language to the other. But there were 130 proposals and actions that were part of the Sevilla Platform for Action. So a combination of kind of commitments from member states, multilateral development banks, international institutions, civil society, and think tanks. And I would love to kind of break them in three different groups. The first one related to multilateral development banks and public development banks. The second on taxation, and third on that. So when it comes to multilateral development banks, a first key achievement of the Compromiso de Sevilla was to kind of recognize the need for the lending of MDBs to potentially tripling. For many of you in the listening to the call, this doesn't sound relatively new, but actually this came from an independent commission of the G20, but it's never been endorsed by the G20. So this is a very kind of clear commitment from member states and ultimately shareholders of these institutions. Second, a great recognition of the role of national development banks in boosting financing at the country level. That wasn't the case in Addis Ababa 10 years ago, and a collaboration between multilateral development banks and national development banks at the country level. Third, a number of initiatives by the Inter-American Development Bank and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to boost local currency lending, and a joint pool for technical assistance for project preparation. In the past, my own experience, this is very much kind of fragmenting and scattered. Second, on taxation, a renewed commitment to double ODA to boost tax administration and tax policy. Second, a number of coalitions, the first one between Brazil and Spain, launching a kind of a program to initiate and promote global taxation of the super rich. 8 nations launch a program to explore levies on premium aviation, talking about business class flight and private jets. When it comes to that, I'll make 3 different points. First, the creation of a borrowers club that is a counterpart to the Paris Club, where most of the kind of lenders are organized themselves. The second point is a number of coalitions to build platforms for debt for development swaps. There is particularly a kind of a group promoting also among multilateral development banks that post-closes alliance. That means that when there is a need to kind of stop payment, the rules are already embedded in the contracts. And the final point is the creation of an intergovernmental process on that, particularly to look into the reform of the data architecture and solutions to boost that sustainability. That leads me actually to the areas where I would have loved to see greater kind of progress. On that, yes, we have an intergovernmental process on that, but civil society organizations, as many of you I'm pretty sure have advocated, would have loved to see a UN framework convention on tax that wasn't achieved. Second, in terms of kind of challenges, I would have loved to see a greater recognition of the changing landscape for official development assistance. It's there, but we are certainly a pivotal moment for that. And third, while there's a greater recognition to boost the voice and representation of developing and emerging countries in the structures of international financial institutions, it lacks granularity and proposals. And in 1 minute, Philip and colleagues, if I may, what's next? To a certain extent, of course, it's time, as I said in my first kind of icebreaker, it's really the time to move from recommendations to results. And the most important point will be to actually keep monitoring at the FFD forum every April, in-depth analysis of the different commitments and different buckets, but also how the commitments in the Sevilla platform for action was taken forward. And there is, I was hoping to see that much more in this version of on the final version of the outcome document. It was in earlier version, an equivalent to the VNRs for financing for development. The language has been diluted, somehow encouraging, inviting countries to report progress on implementation to the FFD outcome documents. And as Lotta mentioned, there's been a lot of learning over time. The VNRs have matured, have developed over time, and I hope there could be some kind of lessons that can be taken also in the context of the financing for development outcome and in tracking the progress of the Sevilla outcome document. And I'll stop here.
Thank you, Annalisa, but I would not let you go right away, but ask you about the linkages with the HLPF. Lotta also mentioned the World Social Summit in November in Qatar. So how are you seeing how this Sevilla Action Plan is interconnecting with the ongoing processes and negotiations in the multilateral space, and how can we best connect it to these ongoing agendas?
So certainly the kind of boost of financing to the kind of social sectors, there are a number of kind of areas that are mentioned in the Compromiso de Sevilla, but certainly the kind of what Social Summit can take forward. And I would say certainly within a number of the 130 Sevilla Platform for Action, several of them do kind of refer to the social sectors, to a number of SDGs, and that's where the attention should be kind of brought upon to take them forward.
Well noted, and we will come back to you in a moment as well. Annalisa, thank you for this first perceptions about Seville, its outcomes, and how it is connecting to the ongoing agenda. Our person that was in Seville, it's our colleague Emmanuel, who is with us today. And Emmanuel, I have on my talking points here a question on how this outcomes of the FFD4 and the HLPF can help restore trust in multilateralism and regaining momentum on the SDGs. And I'm reading this out to you because those are two very, very big questions. And you need very, very short answers to give us. So help us out. What were actually your perspectives coming out of Seville, how you're actually seeing if trust it's being rebuilt, and how the momentum for the SDGs is there or it's not in order to move forward. We would like to take or hear your take about it. Emmanuel, it's an afternoon for you in Geneva right now, and it's good to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Philip. Yeah, so when it comes to multilateralism at large and the progress for sustainable development, those are really the big swirlings that are happening right now. I think first, it's really important to still kind of maintain a level of optimism. Of course, not naivety, but I think what FFD4 showed me, at least, was that there are still participants who are coming to the table. I was also able to, track and sit in through some of the informal negotiations for the FFD4 document that were taking place in New York prior to Seville. And these line-by-line negotiations, the member states are very particular about which words, about what to include, what to take out. And so the fact that they are still showing up says something. If they did not care, if they did not trust the system, they would not be participating. In line with that, like Annalisa was saying, I believe that the turnout and the energy at FFD4, despite the heat, was also a testament for the will to want to see what we can build moving forward, taking the good bones of the past 80 years of international cooperation and hopefully ambitiously reform it for the next 80 years ad infinitum. I think what is necessary, however, is that keyword ambition here. I think the Compromiso de Sevilla, the Seville commitment, definitely is a good starting point. But this kind of energy cannot be dissipated. And I think that we genuinely need to see a lot more important, ambitious reform to these and not just placating the systems. We need to actually look at the systemic issues and be bold and courageous enough to change up the power dynamics that has previously gotten us to this point.
Let me do a follow-up here. Emmanuel, you are also a UN youth representative, and we just went through the Pact of the Future and Future Generations last year, which is an ongoing process. How much do you actually perceived from the youth perspective? Was it more a checklist to have you in the room, or was there real participation? And what is the momentum you're seeing in the involvement of other stakeholders, including the youth at all its expressions? What was your take in Seville? Did you talk to yourself? Did you actually were able to engage with governments and others? What were your perspectives about this?
Yeah, so since the Summit of the Future, there has been this increasing trend towards youth participatory engagement that I think has been beneficial and it has been on an increasing trend. However, largely, I would still contend that youth engagement in UN processes is still largely tokenistic, unfortunately. I wouldn't so much say that at FFD4, it was just a checkbox to have youth because there was a genuine attempt to have, there was for those who weren't able to make it, there was many side events that were led by youth, organized by youth, co-organized with member states and other UN agencies. So there is that attempt to actually platform us for our message and our ideas to be heard. However, and this even comes down to just the logistics of the event or who is able to be in which room, there is still a lot that bars youth from effective participation or influencing decision making at these conferences. Not just youth, but civil society as a whole. They weren't able to freely attend the main sessions of the forum where the member states, where the heads of states, the heads of the multilateral development banks were meeting. And so it was hard to even engage in bilateral discussions for youth interest groups with these, power brokers, essentially. It did occur. I represented the major group for children and youth, the Children and Youth International at the conference, and we were able to establish some connections with member states. So that is definitely beneficial. But for the amount of civil society members that showed up, there was not enough connection with the rest of the system. And just also to add on, I forgot to mention with your previous part of your question and how we can revitalize specifically progress towards sustainable development. I think what is necessary is a reframing of what SDGs are, or not even goals, so to speak, but just what sustainable development is. I think, 5 years until 2030, it is hard to make it seem that we are going to accomplish all of these goals 100% in these next 5 years. I think what's important is that even if we do not, that sustainable development has to continue. It's a process rather than a benchmark that we must meet at a particular deadline. Of course, it is good to make progress by 2030, but we cannot lose track of why sustainable development is important, even if it does not happen at 2030.
Emmanuel, hold that idea because I will be coming back to you. But before doing so, I will pass the floor to my colleague Lynn. And Lynn, before actually giving you the floor and asking you about Beyond GDP and how this is actually connecting to this year's HLPF and broader agenda, I wanted to let you know, since you are the co-host of this event, that we have over 400 people connected in this webinar. 60% of them are in Western Europe. We have 18% from Asia Pacific, 7% from Latin America and the Caribbean. They're just waking up, so that's our excuse, but I hope they will be joining a little bit more. Eastern Europe with 3%, and also Africa, like I mentioned, with 12%. So we have a real diverse audience with us today, and the interesting thing about it is they are really from every corner of the world. So it would be interesting that we also hear from you, Lynn, now beyond GDP and how this is actually something as a universal agenda and not only very specific to the global south, but with a lens that goes much further than this. So Lynn, it is good to have you here. Once again, thank you for the good collaboration, and we want to hear from you now, and over to you.
Yes, thank you. So one of the items that was discussed at the Financing for Development conference and had carried over from the Pact for the Future, and actually has its roots even further back. It's the very last target in the SDG framework. SDG 17, target 19, calls for building on initiatives that complement GDP. And so that's the Beyond GDP conversation. Building complementary measures for measuring a country's wealth that take into account the human, natural, social, produced, and financial capital, and not just looking at the produced and the financial capital that GDP tells us about. So FFD4 outcome reinforced the Pact for the Future outcome, which called for a high-level panel to be created to evaluate and develop some recommendations. That high-level panel was appointed recently, and the Pact for the Future and the FFD outcome called for an intercessional process after the recommendations come out from this high-level panel. And so in preparation for this this intercessional process, during the FFD4 meeting, a high-level or group of friends of governments that are friends of Beyond GDP was announced, with Spain is kind of leading that. And also IST's partners at the Beyond Lab, which is in Geneva, announced and launched a youth alliance for Beyond GDP, so that there are these groups forming to carry on this conversation. And I see these as really important entry points back into the SDGs. These issues are being taken up, and different groups are running with them and thinking about how to take them forward. And I guess just another entry point that I want to talk about is the Synergies conversation. So this relates directly to HLPF. There's a SDGs and climate synergies process. There in May, there was another meeting in Copenhagen. There's some reports coming out talking about, what are the synergies between the SDGs and climate, and getting the conversation going around that. At the Bonn Climate Conference last month, as well as at the Convention for Biological Diversity, there's a conversation going on synergies between the SDGs, or between biodiversity and climate and land, bringing in health and water even. And so that these are, entry points really into the SDG framework, as well as, bringing these conversations of the interlinkages into other fora. So I guess just in terms of kind of thinking about regaining momentum and reviving the narrative of the SDGs, I think that there are a lot of entry points out there if you, look at a number of processes.
Thank you, Lynn, also for your comments and inputs. This is helpful because we want now to actually bring you back on the panel discussions. And I would like, Lotta, actually to start with you again, because this is the time you have heard now from experts from around the world. There are questions popping up in the chat as well, and we encourage our colleagues to put them in, because my colleague Eleonora will address some of them and let the panelists know. But Lotta, you heard already the colleagues. Do you have actually some questions now that they have told us their perceptions and expertise coming out of international negotiations that are ongoing or were ongoing? I wanted to actually give you the floor to address a question or comment if you want to make it, and to our other colleagues as well, because I always get messages through my chat. Could you ask this and that person about a specific issue? So I'm taking it out of the chat and giving the floor to all of you to address your questions or comments of what you have heard, and then I will bring in the audience as well to address their concerns and questions. So over to you.
Thank you, Philip. Not so much a question, but a quick comment building on what Lynn just outlined on the need to build synergies between the different agendas. There is, of course, a close interlinkage, as Lynn said, between the SDGs and the climate agenda. And indeed, there was recently a SDG Climate Synergies conference that was held in May in Copenhagen. Happy to let you know that during the HLPF in July, there will be a special event which will focus precisely on SDG Climate Synergies, and we look to kind of bring the discussions that took place in Copenhagen even further. So keep that on your radar screens, everyone, please. Thank you.
Well noted. Thank you very much, Lotta. And now, Emmanuel, I want also to give you the opportunity for perceptions and feedback of what you have heard, because like I said, we are going to bring in the colleagues online in a minute.
Yes, I think one of the important points that I've heard from all the colleagues here is that there's a lot of momentum that has to be built upon in order when it comes to revitalizing multilateralism. Continuing from FFD4 into HLPF, and then next April in the FFD form, right? We have to capitalize on these moments to ensure that we are actually following through with what we are writing down in these resolutions, these outcome documents, and these, ministerial declarations. And I think that's important when we talk about the restoring trust in the multilateral system, because at a certain point, if it's just talking, if it's just commitments without follow through, the partners who are seeking, especially in the development cooperation, the developing countries who are seeking support, who are seeking, betterment for their country, and if they're not seeing those results, they're going to fall out. They're going to look elsewhere for their own needs and increasingly become, withdraw from the international system. And so I think we are at a point where I believe Annalisa said we really need to turn commitment into action.
Commitment into action, Annalise, I think that is something that all of us want. What very specifically, tell us your next steps actually as a think tanker. How can we contribute from civil society, think tank community, academia to actually push this agenda forward? Any takes from your side?
So certainly, I would say one of the kind of key innovations versus what happened at Addis Ababa 10 years ago is this Sevilla platform for action. So Please have a look online there. As I said, there are 130 different kind of commitments by different organizations. I know that the list will be slightly kind of updated. There are also the recording online of the media launches, but I would encourage everyone on the call to look at it. I will pop the link into the chat. It covers different areas on financing, but also on the sustainable development goals, and that's very important. I would encourage everyone to make sure that as many member states as possible join those initiatives. There are already the links and be behind the organization pushing that kind of particular agenda. Many of them are actually quite concrete and activities and very much linked with the Compromiso de Sevilla.
So if I understand you right, Annalisa, it is a good idea to actually engage with our own governments at this very moment and try to push the needle for their engagement and concrete actions. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I will pop the link into the chat. I believe that the desert team, once they're back and regained their kind of breath, will be able to kind of update the list. I know for sure, because I've been involved in a couple of Sevilla of the actions on the platform, there are already some governments kind of on top of those already mentioned. But I would encourage everyone on the call to have a look at the list and trying to see whether some of the governments can be actually behind that and keep again the momentum at the next FFD forum in April 2026.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. And I think a point well taken as well to the colleagues in UNDESA that deserve at least a week's break after several months of very hard work. So kudos to that. And hopefully they get their well-deserved days off in order to start on the right foot again. Lynn, also to you, any question, perception of what you have heard, and especially on how we can also connect as a think tank community to this broader agenda, and what can we actually bring into the discussion now that it needs a brain trust, but also momentum coming forward?
Yes, I think picking up on what Annalisa said and also what Lotta said earlier, the Voluntary National Reviews are a really important piece of the HLPF celebrating their 10th kind of anniversary. But they are an entry point for us to go in and push our governments to do things. And also the fact that many countries have done this now 2 or 3 times, learning from this national process, and then also, thinking about the synergies. How can we try to combine these with the NDCs, the nationally determined contributions for climate change, or what's the relationship with the biodiversity national planning, and really help our governments, think holistically about all this national planning, and then push them to implement what they've written down on paper.
Thank you, Lynn, for your input as well. And now I would like to connect to our colleague Eleonora, who is actually looking at the chat, looking at the questions that you have made. So Eleonora, I can see you now. A good morning to you or afternoon. Can you tell us what colleagues are saying online and what they're asking very specifically to the panelists?
Thank you very much, Philip, and greetings from ISD Geneva. Yes, we received some questions that I tried to maybe cluster in 3 areas. So the first one, I think it's everyone, also based on your expectations as well, what is going to happen beyond 2030 for the SDGs. So there is a lot about that, including will there be an extension of the timeline, or will there be a review of the current number of SDGs, or in general? The second point, it's more of about the role of the regional level, including the local voluntary local reviews in advancing SDG efforts. And maybe linked to that, I would also integrate the role as well of other stakeholders at the regional level, and including, of course, use in advancing those sustainable development efforts, and of course, as related to this conversation on the role of regions to restoring trust in multilateralism. So for the moment, those are the biggest questions, but I'll let you, Philip, address those to the speakers.
Thank you, Eleonora, and I encourage colleagues, if you have something, a question or a comment, to make it in the chat so that we can actually address it to the panelists. Before giving the floor to our panelists, I have to say I have been surprised that I have not heard one agenda coming out from the questions nor from the participants or the panelists, which is the UN reform at large. This is something that has been on several of our plates now for weeks or months. And I do not know, and I would like to start with that question, is the UN reform, UN80, the multilateral crisis, having a big effect on this? We heard that Seville went better than expected. So could we say we are holding the line in Seville, we are pushing back, or we are actually pushing forward? It would be interesting to hear from you if this has any relations and how so, if you see that. And then we have the role of the regional level and of non-state actors into this. We already addressed some of it, and the SDG timeline. So let me start first with the question about reform and how this is relating to the multilateral crisis to this agenda. And then I would like to give the first question over to Lotta about the SDG timeline, if she has the magic ball to let us know how the future will look like. And then we will give the floor to the other colleagues. So to make life a little bit easier, Lotta, could you start about the SDG timeline, and then I will address at large UN reform. If you would like to do it as a member of the UN, you're welcome to do so. If you don't, I understand, and we will give the floor also to colleagues that are in the panel. So over to you.
Thank you. I would actually, let me come in on the UN80 as well. Just to note that obviously the UN80 UN reform is really, so to say, taking up the oxygen here at UN headquarters of pretty much every process, and it is unavoidable. HLPF also will touch upon the UN reform. This is a big priority for the current president of ECOSOC, the permanent representative of Canada to the UN. He has invited member states to use the so-called general debate of the high-level political forum and high-level segment of ECOSOC, which happens during the last 3 days, to also voice their views about UN80, UN reform, and what kind of multilateral system do we need moving forward. So keep an eye out on that general debate. In addition, the 24th of July is the so-called high-level segment of ECOSOC, which builds on the HLPF. And that day will be really dedicated to discussing the future role of ECOSOC in the multilateral system. How can we strengthen the Economic and Social Council, and really kind of building on the UN reform discussions. And just to put on all of your radar screens, at the next 80th session of the General Assembly, member states are supposed to discuss and negotiate the review of both the Economic and Social Council and the High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. So it kind of all comes together in a way in that sense. Now, I'll be very brief about the future, the beyond 2030. Member states in the Pact for the Future, they have clearly said that the High-Level Political Forum in 2027, convened under the General Assembly, or the so-called SDG Summit, is expected to be the place where member states will give some direction and views on what could potentially be a process for discussing the successor of the SDGs. Obviously, discussions are happening at the moment already in different corners, but I would say that the 2027 HLPF SDG Summit will be the moment when we will have a better clarity. Thank you.
Thank you, Lotta, for your take. And I will now like to address the question about the role of non-state actors. We have heard this once and again in the chat. If governments are paying attention to the brain trust that it's around them from civil society, academia, think tanks, and others. And Emmanuel, we already discussed actually this point, but since it came up once and again in the chat, once again, your perspective of civil engagement in these processes, and hopefully some concrete ideas that you may share on how we can boost this. I mean, you already were mentioning major groups and other stakeholders, but there must be other ways as well where we can complement those efforts of major groups through civil society engagement at different levels. So any ideas from your side?
Yes. So first, I would like to say that subnational engagement, consultation, and concrete coordination is fundamental to the future of multilateralism, right? That's the multi in the equation here. We need to encourage much more actors in the conversation. I've done a lot of work with UN Habitat as well, and they are kind of leading the charge when it comes to, Local 2030 Coalition and the localization of the SDGs, as well as the VLRs, the Voluntary Local Reviews. During this HLPF, there will be a 4th edition of the VLR VSR days for the voluntary subnational reviews. That for anybody interested on that subnational level, definitely check out. And there's growing traction for increasing acceptance for open invitations for cities and other subnational actors to submit these VLRs and VSRs. So the first recommendation is continue that encouragement of these VSRs and VLRs. Hopefully in the upcoming ministerial declaration from as the outcome from the HLPF, we will see kind of a support for increasing VLRs and VSRs. Second, when it comes to non-governmental arrangements, so NGOs, civil society, youth groups, I think it is trying to actually find a way where these groups can be the most effective. And that will also then address the general tokenism of youth engagement in general, because I think one of the issues is that right now, myself included, youth and other civil society advocates, we are rattling the chains, outside the doors, wanting a space in. Now, as we are getting the space, we need to actually find the mechanisms and the processes that we can best contribute to, because realistically, we do not have the capacity to contribute to every single process. We still do need nation states. We do still need member states on some level. And so what I would like to see is greater coordination with the newly founded UN Youth Office, potentially submitting a report to the Secretary General on the substantive areas within the United Nations that youth engagement would be the most beneficial. And then from there, they can conduct global youth consultations to actually then submit some sort of annual or biennial report that would then be used, basically the youth agenda, to then contribute to positions within the United Nations. So just to sum, I think increasing the prevalence of VLRs and VSRs, and then also finding the precise areas within the UN that youth and civil society can play.
Thank you, Manuel, for this feedback, which is very helpful, and it brings me to Annalisa and then to Lynn, because time is now wrapping up in order to say goodbye, but we will do so after hearing from them. Annalisa, over to you about the next steps and also the engagement of non-state actors on how we can actually trigger this process forward.
Thank you so much, Philip, for this question. And I do share the concern Emmanuel raised about the organization in Sevilla and the participation, particularly in multi-stakeholders platforms that are usually kind of much more kind of open to civil society organizations. But I have to say that the run-up to the outcome document is actually a very good example how to bring in civil society, think tanks, and academia. The Compromiso de Sevilla wasn't agreed just on the 17th of June 2025. Actually, the process, as I mentioned earlier on, started at the end of June with the first preparatory conference in Addis Ababa. And one key element, I really commend the Spain as kind of host of the Financing for Development Conference and the DESA team at the CDO office was to kind of create a platform that started from September last year to produce, to input short contributions of 4 pages on ideas, recommendations, and platforms that ended up in the Elements paper. The first, the zero outcome document wasn't perfect, but it really took into account the views and the kind of ideas that came from member states, civil society organizations, think tank, and academia. Then things, of course, went into the kind of negotiations, but this was a key and very kind of good example on how to bring in civil society, non-state actors at the very early stages of the ideas and recommendations of such an important process. And I hope this could be also an example for other UN processes to bring in non-state actor voices.
Good practices to have in mind. We will come back to Lotta and others since we have knowledge platforms actually to systematize this and have this as a learning experience. Simply to let you know, I'm right now in Panama, Annalisa, with UN colleagues since they are starting to invite non-state actors in their internal workshops to hearing about partnerships and others. So I believe this is also inviting to optimism that we actually have now mechanisms to cooperate and also share knowledge and good practices. So I can only encourage this way forward for all agencies, funds, and programs. And Lynn, we're coming to an end, and it's actually good that it's done by you because as a co-host, we would like to hear your final reflections before saying goodbye to our colleagues.
Yes, well, so thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the panelists. This has been a really rich discussion, and I think really showing how exciting and how important the HLPF can be and will be this year. Just the bringing people together and having these conversations is so important, especially when trust is thin, fraying. Process really is important in helping to restore trust. And so having these opportunities to come together and to share are so important. In the next 8 days for the HLPF, in addition to being able to watch the events remotely on web TV, for those who will be there, you can see them in person. The Earth Negotiations Bulletin, ISD's reporting service, will be there covering the meetings with daily reports, photos, and then a summary at the end. And so we'll be sending everyone the links for that, and hope you'll tune into that. Thank you so much for this collaboration, and with SEPE and DESA. Thank you so much, Lotta, for joining us, and to the other panelists, and to everyone who has joined us.
Well, that makes my job much easier to say goodbye because you almost said everything, Lynn. To the panelists, a big thank you to share your thoughts and also information about what comes and what we can expect at this year's HLPF. Especially thank you to our audience from around the world. The interest, it's great to see that we keep up the momentum. We certainly will inform, and as you have heard, IISD will be on the ground informing, so that will be a great resource. And last but not least, to our colleagues Eleonora and Matthew, who in the back office actually were the ones making this all happen. Thank you very much. And to all of you around the world, a good morning, a good afternoon, or a good rest and end of the day. It has been from CEPEI and IISD once again a pleasure to having you in this webinar. We hope to see you again, and it's a goodbye, a gracias, and thank you to all of you. Ciao.